highest quality, a storied history, and a legacy of luxury. No watch brand in the world is more synonymous with the high life than Rolex. But would you believe that the company was founded by an orphan from Germany? That's right. A man by the name of Hans Wilsdorf was the visionary behind the leader in watch manufacturing we all know and love today. Throughout his life, Hans was met with opposition, but it was his love for watchmaking that helped him push through it all and allowed Rolex to climb to the top of the mountain. This is the story of how Hans Wilsdorf went from orphanage to massive success with Rolex. In 1881, Hans Wilsdorf was born in Bavaria, Germany, to a well-off middle-class family. His parents were involved in the business of selling iron tools. Unfortunately for Hans, he lost his mother Anna when he was very young, and at the age of 12, his father Johann passed as well, leaving young Hans as an orphan. Luckily for Hans, his uncles sold the family business, and some of the money was used to send Hans and his sister off to a fantastic boarding school in Coburg, not far from his hometown. Hans had excellent grades in school and became very interested in mathematics and languages. His interest in languages would prove to be influential in his life, as Hans decided he wanted to venture out into the world and work internationally. Inspired, Hans moved to Geneva, Switzerland, where he landed a job working for a pearl merchant. Hans learned some very valuable lessons during his time working in Switzerland. As it turned out, the company he worked for didn't create any of the pearls they sold, but they still made themselves a lot of money by mastering the art of marketing and selling the pearls. After some time in Geneva, Hans Wilsdorf began working for Kuno Korten, which was an exporter of Swiss pocket watches. Hans actually landed this job because of his ability to read and write in English, which was a skill he picked up during his time in boarding school. Kuno Korten tasked Hans with handling the company's business with the British Empire and the United States. It was also during this time that Hans developed a passion for watches. He was amazed by the way watches moved and the accuracy of the ones made by Kuno Korten. Hans also learned about another watchmaker nearby called Egler, whose innovations caught the eye of Hans. Egler was at the time capable of creating watches with small enough movements to be worn on the wrist. This methodology was not popular at the time, though, because men viewed wristwatches as being a joke and incapable of accurately telling time due to their size. None of this bothered Hans, though. Hans was a visionary in the space and strongly believed that as time passed, pocket watches would go out of style and a market would open for wristwatches. Hans was so confident in his vision that he made the largest order of wristwatches in history, at that point, from Egler. Armed with the knowledge he picked up in Geneva, a connection with Egler, and a strong passion for watchmaking, he united with his brother-in-law, Alfred James Davis, to take his love for watches to a new level. In 1905, the two went on to establish their own watch exporter in England and called it Wilsdorf and Davis Company. The company's goal was a simple one: produce timepieces of the highest quality and sell them for affordable prices. It only took 3 years for Wilsdorf and Davis to explode into one of the leaders in British watch manufacturing. As the company's success grew, the two men thought it was time for a rebrand. They wanted something that they could place on the dials of the watches they were exporting. This was actually against the norms at the time, as the standard was to place the importer's name on the dials. But norms were not a part of the vocabulary of Hans Wilsdorf. At the time, Rolex wasn't a part of Hans' vocabulary either. In fact, Rolex wasn't even a word when Hans came up with the name for the now iconic brand. Hans came up with hundreds of names and mixed and matched all the letters of the alphabet, but nothing felt right to him. However, one morning as Hans was going for a ride on a double-decker powered by horses through the streets of London, a genie supposedly whispered the name Rolex into his ear, and a watchmaking giant was born. The name was perfect in many ways. It was sleek, easy to pronounce, and short enough to fit on the dial of a watch alongside the name of the importer. Hans started having his watches inscribed with Rolex, and over time, the name became synonymous with watchmaking excellence. With a unique name and identity, Rolex watches were poised to take over the watch manufacturing space. By 1910, Hans Wilsdorf sent one of his Rolex watches to Bienne. There, the official watch rating center awarded the watch with the Swiss Certificate of Chronometric Precision. This was of great significance, as Hans' Rolex was the first wristwatch in history to receive the award. It would appear that Hans' strong passion and vision was paying off. By the time 1914 rolled around, Rolex watches were still winning awards for their precision, with a 25mm Rolex receiving Class A precision, which at the time had been only given to marine chronometers. Unfortunately, this year also marked the beginning of World War I. Heavy taxes by the British government forced Hans to start exporting out of Bienne instead of London. Luckily for Hans, though, his ties with Egler allowed for a smooth transition of the company's operations. As the company moved on from England, a new headquarters was built in Geneva in 1919, and in 1926, Hans Wilsdorf reminded the world of his innovative nature. After purchasing a patent for a waterproof watch case, Hans went to work and made modifications where he saw fit. Shortly thereafter, with improvements made, the first waterproof and dustproof wristwatch in the world was created, and it was called the Rolex Oyster. Tuning back into his skills for marketing that he learned from his time working for a pearl merchant and years in the watch business, Hans decided that there was a great opportunity to market the Oyster. So he hooked up with Mercedes Gleitz, a professional swimmer from England, with an oyster as she made an attempt to swim the English Channel. Gleitz spent more than 10 hours in the water with the Oyster, and the wristwatch was in perfect condition after the swim. At this point, Hans' eyes lit up, and he managed to land a headline on a famous newspaper known as the Daily Mail, celebrating what was dubbed as the greatest triumph in watchmaking at the time. Success would continue to find Rolex as time went on. In 1931, Rolex released the first self-winding watch using a perpetual rotor. The rotor was implemented to wind up the watch on its own with smooth precision and in silence when the watch is being worn. The perpetual movement was a crucial innovation for the company and is still used today when the company manufactures its watches. Hans Wilsdorf had shown time and time again in Rolex's early history that he and his company were a leader in the watchmaking space. After the success he had with Mercedes Gleitz and the Rolex Oyster, Hans continued to seek out other similar opportunities to elevate his brand to new heights. Hans knew just how valuable branding was and wanted other people who had name recognition to wear Rolex. So, in 1933, the first people to fly over Mount Everest were wearing Rolex Oysters. On top of that, so was Sir Malcolm Campbell, a driver that set a record for fastest land speed recorded when driving at Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah. As Rolex grew its profile, it continued to put out better and better products. 1945 saw the company release the Rolex Datejust, which was the first watch to show the date in a window instead of through the traditional pointer hand. The watch also had a bracelet known as the Jubilee. The Datejust would go on to become one of the most famous in the Rolex collection and was even gifted to Winston Churchill in 1948. The 1950s saw a huge expansion for Rolex. More watches were designed than ever before by the company. The watches served various purposes as well. For example, in 1953, Hans hooked up another Mount Everest expedition with Rolex watches. Submariners were also given a Rolex specifically designed to be used for diving deep underwater. Business was good, and the innovations were even better for Rolex. Hans Wilsdorf was an innovator throughout his whole life up until his passing in 1960. Although put in a tough spot by the death of his parents at such a young age, he managed to pave a path towards greatness as a watchmaker and helped take his vision for wristwatches to an unthinkable level. His innovation, passion, and skill for watchmaking helped Rolex etch its name as one of the most iconic luxury watch brands ever.